Okay everybody, in this video I'll give you a brief overview of the historical events, primarily in Europe, from the end of the 15th century until the end of the First World War in 1918. So the beginning of modern times is usually dated, among other things, with the discovery of America by Columbus, or with the beginning of Reformation. The Reformation began in 1517. America was discovered by Columbus in 1492. So, in the beginning of Reformation, the German preacher Martin Luther demanded a reform of the Catholic Church in order to bring the faith closer to the common man. This meant simplifying church organization and rituals, which would reduce the power of the Pope. It's clear, of course, that the Pope refused to submit to Luther's demands. Thus, Luther and others who protested against the shortcomings of Catholicism founded their own churches, which are called Protestant. As a result of the Reformation and the spread of Protestantism, the Roman Catholic Church lost many believers. The Pope's response to the Reformation is called Counter-Reformation, and it was varied, including both peaceful and aggressive actions. On the one hand, the sale of indulgences, or the letters of redemption, was stopped. More stringent requirements were put forward for the education of priests, and Catholic teaching began to be propagated among the broad masses through the Jesuit order. On the other hand, Catholic authorities began to suppress and even eradicate Protestantism. In the 16th century, more broadly, religious wars started between Protestants and Catholics. Europe plunged into chaos, which would end, as many thought, through the strengthening of royal power. At the beginning of the 17th century, absolute monarchy, or absolutism, developed in Europe. In parallel with all of the above-mentioned processes, expeditions to the New World contributed to the concentration in the hands of European kings of a huge amount of resources, which allowed them to maintain the bureaucratic apparatus that ensured their dominance. The era of colonialism began when European monarchs established and expanded colonies in the New World, competing with each other for these colonies. Of course, there were people critical of the absolute power of kings. In 1605, an Englishman, Guy Fawkes, who was a Catholic, tried to blow up the English Parliament as a protest against the Protestant monarchy. However, the police arrested him and the plot failed. The last major religious conflict in Europe was the 30 Years' War in 1618-1648. It ended with the conclusion of the Peace of Westphalia, according to which many Europeans no longer had to follow the religion of their rulers. However, the weather remained cold throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. It's now called the Little Ice Age. Due to poor living conditions, diseases continued to spread and religious fanaticism deepened, leading to witch hunts. I should also point out that the beaked mask of the plague doctor that we tend to associate with the Black Death, the plague epidemic in the 14th century, so this beaked mask was actually introduced only in the 17th century. Anyways, as a reaction to this religious fanaticism, the late 17th century saw the beginning of the Enlightenment. It was a movement aimed at spreading education and literacy. In art, the Enlightenment in the 18th century was expressed in neoclassicism, which, like the Renaissance, relied on the classical antique heritage. Balance and symmetry were emphasized in art. Paintings and sculptures conveyed a moralizing message. Based in rationalism, the Age of Enlightenment favored scientific and technological progress. Modernization of the country also took place in Russia from the end of the 17th century under Peter I. He became the Emperor of Russia later on in the beginning of the 18th century. Thanks to scientific innovations and the influx of resources from the colonies, the Industrial Revolution or industrialization began in Europe in the 18th century. Plants and factories were created, which ensured mass production. The critical thinking, typical of the Enlightenment, and the colonies' wariness with the exploitation of the imperial centers led to the American Revolutionary War against the English king in the late 18th century. The birth of the United States and its victory in this war, in turn, inspired the French to launch their own revolution against their king, Louis XVI. The French Revolution began in 1789 and lasted until 1799. At that time, important civil rights were indeed proclaimed, but the French were soon tired of the revolutionary violence, of this revolutionary state terror. So in 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte, one of the generals in the Revolutionary Army, came to power. He wanted to conquer all of Europe. The Napoleonic Wars continued until 1815. During the wars, Napoleon established certain democratic freedoms in the conquered territories. The hostilities ended with the defeat of France. In 1814-1815, European leaders held meetings to decide the fate of France and how to organize relations between European countries. These meetings are called the Congress of Vienna because they took place in Vienna, the capital of Austria. The purpose of the Congress of Vienna was to prevent new major revolutions in Europe that could threaten the power of traditional monarchs. The Congress decided to restore monarchy in Europe, including France. It also called on Europeans to follow traditional religious authorities. The decisions of the Vienna Congress contributed to the emergence of conservatism as a political ideology. However, many freedom-loving Europeans did not want to blindly obey kings and spiritual leaders. They craved personal freedoms, which they enjoyed to a certain extent under Napoleon. Therefore, in 1848, revolutions took place in many European countries, including France, directed against conservatism and the monarchical system. These revolutions are associated with the emergence of a new ideology, liberalism. For liberals, the main priority is not following traditions, but rather placing emphasis on individual freedoms and rights. While the Congress of Vienna restored order before the French Revolution, the revolutions of 1848 required the restoration of Napoleonic liberties, to some extent. Liberals also valued personal freedoms in the sphere of economy. Many were now able to get rich by building factories in the cities. This was part of industrialization and urbanization. The creation of factories required an increase in the labor force, which in turn caused the expansion of cities. Thus, in urban society, the wealth gap between the richest and the poorest widened. In other words, plant managers were getting richer while their workers were getting poorer. Liberals and conservatives were okay with this, but many demanded that the rich share their wealth with the poor. These protesters were not interested in maintaining traditions or personal freedoms. They instead considered achieving equality among all people to be the most important goal. This is how socialism was formed. Socialists organized strikes, formed trade unions, and ran for office. Later in the 19th century, more radical politicians separated from the socialists. these more extreme activists argued that the rich would never voluntarily give up their wealth, that violence could be used to achieve property equality. These politicians perceived not only elections, but also armed uprising and revolution as a means of gaining power. We call such politicians communists. Communists are essentially radical socialists. The founders of communist ideology were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, German philosophers. Now, feminists also sought equality, but their focus was primarily on establishing gender equality, particularly by extending the right to vote to women. However, most people were not familiar with these political movements and theories. People were looking for new ideological content in an urbanized and industrialized world, but they wanted something more simple, more relatable than all these different political theories. And this was offered to them by patriotism and nationalism. It was in the second half of the 19th century that nation-states emerged. In particular, the German Empire was founded in 1871. Love for the motherland was able to unite people, but it was also used by the rulers to strengthen their own power. Parallel to state nationalism, the Industrial Revolution continued, as a result of which new weapons were created and railroads were built. These events contributed to increasing tensions between the European empires. The Titanic tragedy in 1912 also showed that technological progress may not always be beneficial to humanity. Conflicts between European countries, primarily competition for colonial possessions, led to the First World War in 1914. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, particularly to the creation of new weapons and railroads, the European authorities could now very quickly mobilize and arm their forces. By the end of the World War in 1918, the major European empires of Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary had disappeared. In early 1917, the last Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, abdicated the Russian throne and the Democrats came to power. We call this the February Revolution. But these Democrats also lost their popularity among the people due to their decision to continue Russia's involvement in the First World War. In the fall of 1917, as a result of the October Revolution, the communists, headed by Vladimir Lenin, came to power, replacing the Democrats. The communists established a communist dictatorship according to the teachings of Marx and Engels. The communists began to redistribute people's property and land. As a result of the crumbling of big empires, new countries emerged. For example, on February the 24th, 1918, the Republic of Estonia declared its independence. Now, the 20th century, of course, continued, and there's a lot of very interesting developments, very important developments, like the coming to power of Joseph Stalin, of Adolf Hitler, the Second World War, and the Cold War. But this is something that we're going to discuss in one of my following videos. Alright guys, that's it for this one. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.